This video will be explaining the menus of RSM and what we can do in each of them, and the following videos will be about individual usage of those menus. We're going to start with the main screen after you log in, signing into the program with your USB dongle attached to the computer. You'll have these 6 options here, and these 6 options here will provide all that we can with this program for updating and monitoring and checking on DigiScales at a site. On the top left, we have status. Under status, this is where we can check remotely if we have remote access to the site, or instructing the customers on how to check to see if a site is healthy, if it has inactive devices, or if devices are not communicating. We will be able to go under any of these different options and being able to determine that fairly easily. Like under the devices one, we can select the ones here. So if I were to check this meat hand wrap scale for this current location, it would show me that it's healthy, but it does not mean that it is online. Healthy just means that it has all the data that's in RSM inside of the scale on the last check that it had. We can do the same thing with the production scale, and we're going to see that we have an error because this scale has not been communicating with RSM, so it likely has some kind of issue, but it does not tell you that specific issue, so it doesn't give you much information outside of either there's missing data or it hasn't communicated with that scale in some time. Same thing with other options like real-time graphical store. This will send a ping status to each of the devices to see if it can communicate with them, and if it cannot, it will show us in a list which ones communicated and which ones did not. We'll be seeing that here shortly. We can see here in the graphical setup that both of our scales here are offline because they're not connected to the network and the office, and this test scale is currently disabled as it's not being used by any scale whatsoever. So you can use any of these options here to look via department, a real-time store, the graphical setup so you can see it, and then just the store in general. Next, we have the programming section. This is one of the most important sections for the customer and for the technician, as this is where you're going to be doing your programming after you set up the individual departments. So if we go into the production department, we're going to see these options on the left where you have PLU batch price, etc., where you can update and change the information on the scale and send information to it and receive information to it, and this is where you would manipulate that data. You have 2 pages worth of information, and normally on the second page these informations aren't really changed because they're usually done at the scale level, as the RSM program is limited to its functions, and some of these can be expanded at the scale level, which is not supported by the RSM itself. In here you have PLU, which is the main section of RSM that is used. This is how you will update a PLU and its information. We will go into that in a later video, but you see here where you have your list once you select the option, and you can go in and change that data. You have batch pricing, which allows you to change multiple prices on multiple items pricing at one time, up to 50 PLUs. It will send them individually, so it will take some time, probably around 3 to 4 minutes per batch, but you can set them up in advance to send that data after hours or during a low busy period in the day, or in the morning, whenever the associate who's going to be working on this section feels it's best to send it, or immediately if they want to update pricing right then and there. You have global PLU, ingredients, text, label design, and image. Image usually is left alone as well, as they're loaded onto the scale directly. Sending images over RSM can have issues with communication, as it's a lot of data, and if it drops a little bit, it will prevent the rest of the data from sending altogether. so it's usually done directly with USB at the scale. And each of these other menus we'll go into in a later video when we deal with the programming section, but this is the important section when dealing with the customers and how they're going to be using their data on the scale and pricing their product. The second or third option on the top right is data. In this data section, this is where you will be sending the data that is updated manually, or receiving data that you need to do that gets pulled off of the scale if you did anything at the scale level. You can do your imports and exports here if you need data from the RSM program for POS related information and other usages. Sometimes the customer would like to see what is on their devices, which can also be done in the next section, which is reports. But here you can have a few options to choose to send certain data to a scale. So let's say the scale already has all of these on the right side. You don't need to select them when doing the updating. You can just select what you need. Say they only updated one PLU and it was manually and they didn't have it send when they saved it, so you can come in here and select that one PLU and send that data. Currently there is no scale attached to this RSM program, so it will fail and you'll get this red message across the top like this from the earlier status update that we did. And here you can also just select department or device and send certain data to those devices as long as it's inside of RSM. And you'll see where you have these darkened ones where there is no data in RSM to be sent. We'll do more of that on another video with actually sending data to a scale that's connected, and we'll see how that process is. You have managing the ability to look at scheduled data that can be sent on a schedule. This normally isn't used, but may be used in the future when we start to get to different usages of RSM, if that ever becomes capable. So this one hasn't been used yet by us. And other things like synchronize will match the RSM to the scale. Sometimes they put PLUs at the scale level and not the RSM. And if you synchronize, it will send the data from the RSM to the scale, but never from the scale to RSM. Like it says here, it says delete all existing scale data before download, so it will replace all the records, or you keep the existing one so that it doesn't overwrite anything that they made, and then it'll send all the RSM to that individual department, device, or into the entire store. So usually it can become a problem if they're trying to get their data correct, if they are having a miscommunication between the department and the program. These other sections, failed data to scale, is where we would check to see if anything isn't communicating what it was last sent, and you can resend it once you get the communications back online. And everything else is pretty much self-explanatory, and we'll go into details with the import and exporting in another video. You have report, configuration, and diagnostics in the bottom. Diagnostics is usually never accessed. It doesn't have much information that we can do with the scale level because it can make changes that you don't want, and if you're doing it remotely, you don't want to use these. I have yet to use anything under this diagnostic menu because it has never been necessary, but we can go into that in another video as to what they can specifically do for the customer and for the technician. Under reports, this is where you can get a listing of data records, price discrepancies between the scale and the RSM program. If they're changing prices at the scale, this is where you can determine that and see which ones are correct and incorrect. You can look up totals, which is based on how many labels are printed, not necessarily how many labels are sold at the POS. So it can be misleading, but it can show you how many relatively how many labels are being created and how much product is being put on the shelf. That can't be confirmed. It's just based on, again, if they're printing labels, and it's a total running tally of that information. These other totals aren't really used because they're dealing with it as a cash register system outside of the 4600 totals, which is dealing specifically with a wrapper if it is connected to it. We'll go into these specifically in another video regarding reports, because it can take up a little bit of time to explaining how to get that set up. And the last option is configuration. This is where the technician would set up the individual store program, where you can get them set up before installation on their store, which will just have their information, their barcode type if they have one. This particular site did not have one, so it shows non-barcode initially, and their default print formats. You have the department setup, the main group setups, the devices, the default programming setups, preset key and RSM settings. A lot of these information won't transfer over like preset keys. Normally they're set up individually per site, so they're not kept in RSM across the board. And other things that we'll be able to address in configuration specifically in a separate video. RSM settings is where we would make changes to our RSM program if we needed to do things for this individual site, or if we're needing to change the database of the store, we can change the database of the store here. This is where we would be able to allow RSM to be used by a technician across different sites to be able to check on store data and update their own data when they visit the site and things like that, and create backups and restores and anything else that's required. In here we have different options that can help set us up the store, like the devices, where we would change the setting and configuration if we needed to update IP addressing, and other things, and all of these other options, which we'll go into a later video. Across these 6 sections we can use RSM to help a store keep up to date on their pricing for their scales, and to monitor any changes that are happening at the scale level in the department from a single computer in the office, wherever they would like this program located. And that would cover the menus of RSM and accessing the different sections and what they would each have information for, and how they would handle the data that would be in and out of the scales.